Yes, so I am a second-year master's student in the Marine Resource Management program. And, sorry, see, you can't see my voice. Is this good? Okay. And I am actually conducting an ecological assessment of the potential to reintroduce sea otters. So I have a lot of vested interest in this meeting today. But as Bob said, I will be reviewing what we currently know of our first translocation attempt. So what I want to talk about is I'll do a brief discussion of all translocations that occurred in this period, get more specific into the Oregon example, but spend the majority of my time talking about Ron's thesis. And if you don't know who Ron is, Ron was actually an ecologist with USGS for a number of years, continuing to monitor sea otter populations in other regions outside of Oregon after his thesis. And then I'll wrap up with what we can say and what we've essentially learned from his research. All right, so I realize a lot of people have presented similar maps like this. So the only thing I want you to pay attention to is note that Oregon was one of several translocation efforts during this time, ranging from Southeast Alaska, British Columbia, Washington, and Oregon. And if we look at our Oregon translocation, we actually see that our effort was the product of two separate release events. The first one occurring in 1970, where we initially brought over 29 sea otters to Redfish Rocks, which is this red dot down here. And then again, a year later in 1971, where we brought even more, 64 sea otters this time. I think it was 24 to Cape Arago, or 24 to Port Orford, and 40 to Cape Arago. But if we look at all translocations by the numbers, we see that we brought a total of 93 sea otters to Oregon, which is about on par with what we see in Washington and British Columbia. And so if we look at these efforts purely from a number of standpoints, it's a little bit perplexing as to why our translocation was a failure and theirs succeeded in the end. And so that's where Ron's thesis comes into play, to fill in some of those knowledge gaps. So when Ron was a master's student from 1971 to 1973, he essentially wanted to know how likely the sea otters were in Oregon to become established. What was the likelihood for success of that translocation taken, given these several ecological considerations? And so to do this, he wanted to know essentially where those sea otters were, how many there were, if they were producing pups, as well as what they were eating, what species, and what types of habitats they were using. Especially, particularly, any further potential suitable habitat where they could move into if the population expanded. So let's look at this first piece. So to determine distribution, Ron collected sightings reports from a variety of biologists and fishermen to determine essentially how far up and down the entire Oregon coast they were distributed. And then he combined these with abundance estimates that he derived from both boat, shoreline, and aerial surveys that was particularly focused on the southern part of the state. And at that time, he'd received these anecdotal stories and tales of sea otters occurring particularly at Simpson Reef and Blanco Reef. And so during those shoreline surveys, he really focused on those two locations. And so if we look at the sightings reports, this does not include all 26 reports that he received. What this is showing you is the geographic extent of where those sightings came from. So what this is saying is that we had one sightings report that was as far south as Brookings, which is the red dot down the southern part, and then as far north as Tillamook Head in the north. So what's interesting with this Tillamook Head point, I'm just going to take this off, that's okay. So what's interesting about this Tillamook Head point is that it's approximately 181 miles from the closest release site. And so I think Jim had mentioned that the average home range is about 20 to 25 miles. So that easily eclipses what we think of as a standard home range. And I actually did some of my own literature review, and the longest home range I could find was about 141 miles, which even falls short of what we see here. So it's possible that, yes, that sighting could have been the most northern extent of an individual otter's home range, or it could also be evidence for an extreme dispersal event, such as immigration or attempting to leave the Oregon coast. If we look at the southern coast, where most of the shoreline surveys were conducted, he was able to confirm that, yes, both Simpson Reef and Blanco Reef received a lot of use by sea otters, and that wasn't very surprising given the amount of abundant prey and suitable habitat at both of these locations. If we look at the number of pups that were produced, we see that we didn't see the first pup on our coastline until about February 1972, which is about 19 months after the first release and 8 months after the second release. But following that first pup, we saw an additional 3 in that same year, followed by 6 the following year. So we are starting to see a slight increase in productivity merely 2 years after they were brought here. In contrast, if we look at mortality, we only knew of 8 total deaths. And those are known deaths. So those are either bodies or carcasses that were reported or discovered. And so if we assume that these are all the deaths that occurred out of the original population of 93, that's a relatively low mortality rate. However, we should also recognize that there are other potential causes of mortality, such as bycatch or shark predation, that would result in us not being able to find the bodies. So we just need to keep that in mind. All right, so what can we infer from these initial numbers? Well, at the close of the study, Ron estimated that approximately only a third of the original translocated population that was brought here remained on the Oregon coast in October 1973, which means that at this time, approximately 2/3 of the original population were unaccounted for or had mysteriously disappeared. And so if we run with the same assumption that there was low mortality, we can't really point to that as a cause, and the fact that we saw some evidence for this major dispersal event, the most plausible explanation is immigration, that they were leaving the Oregon coast for whatever reason. And so then Ron presented some alternative hypotheses as to why this major immigration event occurred. It could have been lack of habitat, it could have been lack of prey, or they were just simply trying to return home to Alaskan waters. Unfortunately, we can't say for certain which of these factors it was, but Ron's 2 other chapters do provide some insights for us. So if we look at the foraging chapter, so here he wanted to know what species of prey they were consuming and how much prey was available for otters in these locations. And so he did this by identifying what species they were consuming just at Simpson Reef, and then he combined these observations with both quantitative and qualitative surveys to derive what the relative availability was of these species. And so what I mean by quantitative surveys is that he counted the number of macroinvertebrates that were located within plot transects. And this was also just at Simpson Reef, so an area that had high utilization by sea otters. And then in his qualitative surveys, he actually qualitatively described how common or uncommon these different species of prey were at 10 different sites. And these were sites that both had sea otters and didn't have sea otters to see if there was any sort of qualitative difference. So if we look at their diet composition, we actually see that the bulk of their diet was, not so surprisingly, sea urchins. But within those sea urchins, the majority of those individuals were purple urchins. However, we should also recognize that an otter's diet is highly dependent on what prey is just readily available in the environment or in the habitat that they're in. And so if we look at his quantitative surveys, so these are the results from the plot transects at Simpson Reef, we see that purple sea urchins are also the most abundant or most available prey species. And so what that tells us is that, yes, they're abundant, and the otters were definitely taking advantage of that plentiful food resource because it made up the majority of their diet. So one thing I found particularly interesting with Ron's thesis is that he mentioned that purple urchin distribution was extremely patchy, and in some areas they completely carpeted the sea floor. And so these are not photos that Ron took. These are actually 2 photos that one of my lab mates took this past summer at Tishner Cove, which is on the coastline of Port Orford. And what this is showing you are all these little purple sea urchins climbing up on the stalks of these kelp and essentially decimating this kelp bed. And it looks like they're pretty much excluding out any other types of, or other forms of life. And so I can't say with any certainty what Ron was referring to, but I assume it was probably something very similar to what we see today. Right. So moving on to the qualitative surveys. So in this part, so again, these are the dive sites. So the blue triangles are showing you the 10 different sites that Ron dove to qualitatively describe how common these species were. And so both of the sites where sea otters were, both Simpson Reef and Blanco Reef, red sea urchins were relatively uncommon, or they weren't encountered at all. But in the other sites where we didn't have sea otters, they were still relatively common. And so this follows the paradigm that we always think about with sea otters and urchins, where if you have high sea otter densities or high sea otter use, you're going to have low urchin densities. So that's not super surprising. In contrast, purple urchins didn't really follow this trend. So at Simpson Reef, he found that they were only reduced in some localized patches. But overall, they were still relatively common. So that further supports just how abundant and how available these little purple urchins are along the southern Oregon coast. One more piece I want to leave you with the qualitative abundance piece was that he actually found some evidence for kelp restoration. And this is particularly at Blanco Reef. And the evidence for this was that in areas where you had exposed rocky surfaces, at Blanco Reef, where you had sea otter use, he found dense beds of kelp. And he also found urchins were hiding within rock crevices, which is essentially an escape mechanism when otters are around. But in sites where you didn't have sea otters, those rocky surfaces were covered by purple urchins. And so that just shows you the types of ecological impact that sea otters can have in these particular areas. So to address this lack of prey theory that I had presented, unfortunately with this study, we can't say for certain whether or not the population had enough prey, just because we saw so many otters leave within a relatively short amount of time. But what we can say is that while they were here, they behaved as sea otters do. And what I mean by that is that they were foraging effectively and successfully, and they were filling that same ecological role that we see in other regions by having reductions in urchins and a reciprocal beneficial increase in kelp biomass. All right, moving on to the habitat chapter of his thesis. So in this chapter, Ron went out and went to various points along the coast and described what types of habitats were in the area. And these were both in areas where we had sea otters and areas where we didn't have sea otters, to try and identify any potentially suitable habitat where they could expand into. And he did this by subdividing the Oregon coast into 3 subsections. So the North Coast, he characterized all habitat as one sort of entity in the North Coast. And that ranged from the Columbia River mouth down to Lincoln City. Central Coast was then down to Coos Bay, and the South Coast was from Coos Bay down to the Oregon-California border. And so what he found was that the North Coast, unfortunately, had the poorest or the least amount of habitat. And that's because in this area, we had these long stretches of sandy beaches with very little rock, very little kelp that we traditionally think of as really good sea otter habitat. The Central Coast got a little better. We still had these long stretches of beaches. The top picture is Agate Beach, which is near Newport. But then we have this area from about Lincoln City down to Newport where there's a lot of interdispersed rocky outcrops. There's a little bit of kelp, some complex shoreline. And so this coastline was slightly better than what we saw on the North Coast. In contrast, the South Coast, that's where we find most of the good quality habitat. This is where we have the majority of our kelp. We have a lot of complex shorelines. We have a lot of these coves and inlets. This bottom picture is Port Orford. We have a lot of coves where sea otters could potentially escape from really intense winter storms. So getting back to addressing these theories, the theory that I presented, this lack of habitat, again, from this one study alone, we can't say whether or not there was enough habitat. And that's purely because, again, we saw this mass exodus so early on. And then furthermore, there are other types of habitats that sea otters use that are important for their survival that may have not have been captured in this assessment or this qualification. But what we can say is that we do have some habitat. And the one thing that Ron's thesis provides us with is documentation that they are using these traditionally favorable habitats that we think of as really important for their survival. So we have documentation of that. Right, so to address this last theory that I presented, this theory of returning home. So our current understanding of sea otters is that juveniles may be the ones that are more apt to go out and find their own territory or pursue more habitat, not the adults. But if you look at the age ratios of all the females that we brought in our translocation, we find that we favored adults almost twice as many as the juveniles. And so Ron's hypothesis was that we had too many adults, too many female adults, and those potentially were the ones that were returning home because of this intense site fidelity that they have. We just didn't have enough juveniles. And so that's potentially why we saw this mass exodus so early on, and potentially, eventually, our failure in our translocation. However, I should note that this is purely hypothetical. So without knowing exactly which of the otters left, this is purely going to remain a hypothesis. And so, last black and white graph I'll leave you all with. The only thing I want to know about this is showing you surveys that were conducted on the Oregon coast after Ron's thesis. And the only thing you should pay attention to is that from 1974 to 1981, the population continued to decrease with fewer and fewer pups being born until about 1982 is when the population was presumed to be extinct or no longer existent on our coastline. All right, in conclusion, so yes, immigration is a very plausible explanation for the initial reductions that Ron noted and the eventual translocation failure. And the evidence for this is that we have little evidence, or I should say, we have lack of evidence to suggest that mortality played a major role. And the fact that we saw sea otters dispersing those 181 miles, that is some evidence for this mass dispersal event or possibly immigration. However, the causes are still unknown. It really could have been any one of these factors or all three of these factors working in combination. And so if we really want to understand what led to that failure or what may potentially be limiting a future translocation, we should really be doing some further analyses of each of these factors. This point, Oregon has potential. This is my own conclusion that I drew from Ron's work. And the one thing that Ron's work shows us is that sea otters can live here. And the evidence for that is that they were foraging successfully and effectively. They were using these habitat features that we traditionally think of as really important, so kelp, rocky substrates, reefs, and they were filling the same ecological role they do in these other locations. Oh, and I should also note, very importantly, they were producing pups. We really shouldn't underestimate that point. That shows that there potentially was enough resources in this area for them to produce pups. And then this what's being done now. So this is sort of a plug for my own research. So when I said that I am doing an ecological assessment of this potential reintroduction, I am taking a closer look at this habitat feature. So I am identifying suitable habitat along our coastline using GIS and using much more recent habitat layers that are now available to us. And then I am taking it a step further, and I am attempting to evaluate or anticipate what the potential impacts may be on our Oregon ecosystems given this intense predation from sea otters. So if at any point you want to talk about my thesis, you you find me afterwards or my advisor, Dr. Lee Torres, and we'd be happy to talk your ear off about what we're planning on doing. So, and no questions, because we're not doing that yet. But thank you.